Olá, tudo bem? Bem-vindo ao meu programa semanal aqui no 247. Hoje eu vou mostrar duas entrevistas para vocês que foram inicialmente gravadas pelo emissora norte-americano The Real News, que eu legendei para vocês assistir em português. A primeira é sobre o assunto que está gerando muito preocupação, muita polêmica, que é o golpe em Bolívia. Às vezes a gente pensa que a idade dos golpes militares acaba, né? Porque o golpe que aconteceu aqui em 2016 foi parlamentar, midiático, jurídico. Mas foi um golpe de estilo clássico, né? Militar, o exército forçou o Evo Morales a sair do país. Mark Weisbrot é um dos jornalistas e economistas mais importantes dos Estados Unidos. Ele é o co-diretor do Center for Economic and Policy Research, ou seja, em português, o Centro para Pesquisa Econômica e Política. É uma organização de pesquisa importante, tem um premiado do Nobel em Economia, Alfred Stiglitz, no Conselho Direcional da entidade. Eu escrevi para eles por alguns anos sobre a América Latina. Tenho maior respeito por eles e eles também, o Weisbrot também participou numa entrevista exclusiva aqui no 247 ano passado. Eles fizeram uma análise sistemática das eleições em Bolívia, chegando à conclusão que não houve fraude eleitoral nenhum e que a Organização dos Estados Americanos agiu de má fé. Ele vai explicar melhor na entrevista. Mas uma coisa que ele não vai falar é o seguinte, que eu vou contar para vocês. A Organização dos Estados Americanos, ele parece como uma organização independente, multilateral, como se fosse uma ONU regional das Américas, etc. Nem todo mundo sabe que 66% do orçamento deles vem do governo dos Estados Unidos. Se eles decidiram, sem nenhum tipo de análise, que houve fraude eleitoral em Bolívia, é porque o governo do Trump estava querendo esse resultado. O segundo entrevista que eu vou mostrar para vocês é com a diretora do Departamento de Ciências Políticas do Boston University, Universidade de Boston, a Netta Crawford. Ela fez parte de uma pesquisa grande que representa uma parceria entre as universidades Brown, onde James Green, amigo do Brasil, ensina, né? Brown, Providence, Rhode Island, e a Universidade de Boston, contando os danos das guerras que aconteceu, criado pelos Estados Unidos desde 11 de setembro quando caiu as torres, né? Eu acho que todo mundo sabe que é muito ruindade que o governo americano, estadunidense fez, mas é bom ter os números também. Oficialmente, através dessa pesquisa, houve 800 mil mortes causadas pela política bélica dos Estados Unidos de guerra sem fim. Além disso, os estadunidenses pagam mais de 6 trilhões de dólares por essas guerras. E querem os Estados Unidos, país onde eu nasci, né? Para dar palpite para Venezuela, para Bolívia, para a China sobre direitos humanos. Um absurdo, né? A única coisa pior é para eles opinar sobre corrupção, que também é o país mais corrupto no mundo, todo mundo sabe isso, né? Então, essa é a segunda entrevista que você vai ver com a Netta Crawford. E eu espero que você goste dos dois. Obrigado por assistir e tenha uma boa domingo para vocês, para todos e todas de vocês. Um abraço.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wolpert in Arlington, Virginia. Protests against the coup government in Bolivia and the violent repression of these protests have continued almost every day since President Evo Morales was forced to resign last week. Last Thursday, the de facto interim president, Janine Áñez, issued a decree that exempts Bolivia's military from criminal prosecution when maintaining public order. In other words, she gave the military a free pass to use lethal force against Morales supporters, which immediately they took advantage of. As a result, the death toll has climbed to 23, with 9 protesters being killed just over the past weekend. The Áñez government is a far-right Christian fundamentalist one that has promised to bring the Bible back to prominence in Bolivia. Also, she has broken off relations with Venezuela, expelled Cuban doctors, and withdrew Bolivia from the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. As the consequences of the coup have become clear, it makes sense to look back at how the Organization of American States, the OAS, enabled this coup. Bolivia's opposition justified the coup on the basis of OAS election observer claims that the October 20th presidential election was highly suspicious. Even though Morales had committed to holding new elections as a result of an OAS audit, this was not good enough for the opposition and the military, which proceeded to force his ouster. He is now in exile in Mexico. Joining me now to discuss the OAS role in the coup in Bolivia is Mark Weisbrod. He is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and is author of the book Failed: What the Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. Thanks for joining us again, Mark.
Thanks for inviting me, Gregory.
So the main controversy about the election which the OAS generated had to do with a margin of victory. The very first election result report from the so-called quick count showed Morales ahead with about 8% of the vote, which was below the 10% point margin that was required to avoid a runoff election. And later official results showed that Morales had 10.4% ahead of his main opponent, Carlos Mesa. But the OAS expressed, quote, deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard to explain change in the trend of the preliminary results. Now, however, an analysis that your colleagues at CEPR conducted last week shows us that Morales' vote count was actually part of an existing trend and quite easy to explain. Tell us about what you found.
Yes, this is very, very important because I think this allegation that they promoted on three separate occasions in their publication, starting with the first press release that the OAS electoral observer mission issued right after the election. This idea that something happened, that the election was somehow stolen, is the foundation of this coup. And it's completely false. And furthermore, I think what you can see if you look at the data is that the OAS was really dishonest about this. They had to know that the story they were telling was false. And I'll try to explain that. What happened was, as you mentioned, there was an interruption in the vote count at 84% of votes tallied, and Evo was ahead by 7.9%. And then the tally resumed. And by the way, this is not even the official tally, so we shouldn't even really be arguing that much about it because it doesn't count for anything. It's just a quick count that's done to let people know what's going on as the votes are coming in. And they don't tell you that either. You know, in most of these, in almost none of these articles do they even tell you that this isn't even the official count. And the official count was never even interrupted. But leaving that aside, this quick count was interrupted at 84%. And then when Evo came back, as you mentioned, his vote was over, when the reporting resumed, Evo's margin was over 10%, which was the amount that he needed in order to avoid a runoff election. And the OAS reports this as though something that they were surprised and concerned and this kind of stuff. Well, if you have ever watched an election return, or maybe can do 8th grade arithmetic or anything like that, the first thing you would ask when this happens is, are those later reporting districts, any precincts, are they different from the ones that reported earlier? And they never mentioned or asked that question in any of their 3 press releases or 2 reports so far. Now that shows you right there that there's something dishonest because they're not enumerate, okay? And the data is all on the web, so anybody can go and look at it and figure out whether those districts were different. And it turns out they were very different. And in fact, they were much more pro-Evo. And that graph you put up is a very revealing one. That's another thing that was very, very dishonest about the OAS reports, because the OAS never mentioned that it wasn't a jump from the first the first 84% that had a 7.9% margin to a over 10% margin. It was a gradual trend that was going on the whole time for a very simple reason. And the simple reason was that the pro-Evo districts reported later, or precincts, I should say, the pro-Evo precincts reported later than the earlier ones. And that's the whole story, and they know it, and they never told it. And they misled the media, and the media had, almost all of them swallowed it and reported it over and over until it became a kind of truth in our post-truth Trumpian world.
We've got a clip here of what Evo Morales had to say about the OAS the other day in an interview that was conducted with him in Mexico.
The OAS took a political decision, not a technical or legal one. This is a report, and I realize from the recommendations of some leftist brothers and sisters that the OAS is not in the service of the people of Latin America, less so the social movements. The OAS is at the service of the North American Empire.
I believe that Evo Morales might be referring to CIPA here, actually. Now, talk to us about the OAS's role in all of this, since it's been used to justify the coup.
Well, the OAS is not always going to do the same thing. It depends on the situation. So in this situation, the Trump administration wanted very much to get rid of this government. And I think Almagro, and they made statements showing this. And in fact, of course, the Trump administration issued a statement supporting the coup itself and saying that it was bringing democracy to Bolivia. So it was very clear where they stood. And Luis Almagro, who's done a lot of terrible things as the Secretary General of the OAS, I think he saw an opportunity here once the election was close. He saw an opportunity to intervene, because I think it had to come from high up in the OAS, because the people in the Electoral Observer Mission, I mean, as I said, they have at least the knowledge that somebody who watches election returns comes in. They could have asked that question. Well, how are these precincts different from the first returns? And also, they didn't have to focus so much on the trap count, on this quick count, because again, it wasn't the binding count. It wasn't even supposed to, intended to, or announced as something that reports the entire count. That's probably why they stopped at 84, because in previous elections, they stopped at 70. It's not the official count. It's just something to keep people informed when the count is still going on. The official count has more safeguards and takes longer. So this was really a deliberate thing. It was something, and they have done this before, by the way. Again, I'm not going to characterize the OAS as being on one side or another in all situations. It's not like that. In fact, probably most observer missions are clean, but they have put their finger on the scales before. So in 2010, for example, there was an election in Haiti, and the OAS did something that probably no election monitors have ever done, which is they set up a commission that looked at the results, and they reversed it without any kind of a recount or even a statistical test. And in fact, the head of that mission admitted on video that it was a political decision. They didn't have any evidence for it. So they changed the results of Haiti's election in 2011. And in fact, Susan Rice, not long after that, in 2011, when Haitians were struggling not to accept that change of election results, she threatened them with a cutoff of aid, desperately needed aid after the earthquake, if they didn't accept this decision, which was really made by the U.S. government through the OAS. That's just one example. There's worse ones. There's another one in Haiti in 2000, which was the foundation of a coup that took place in Haiti in 2004, where the OAS changed its report after they initially had issued a favorable report on the election. They changed it in order to support a cutoff of almost all international aid to Haiti that took place between 2000 and 2004 until the United States-backed coup succeeded in overthrowing the democratically elected president. So this has happened before, and it's a shame that so many journalists don't know this history, or they wouldn't just take the OES's word for it, because really all they have to do is look at the data themselves, or if they can't or don't have time, just, just assign that to somebody, and they would see that the OES is really being extremely dishonest here.
Well, finally, given all of this history, why do you think Evo Morales gave in to the OES so easily when he agreed to abide by its audit?
Yeah, I think that was a mistake. And I think he was hoping that the audit would be, if I just have to guess, I don't know what he was thinking, but he might have been hoping that the audit would be cleaner than what they did in the election, because there was Mexico, for example, was involved and Mexico, the Mexican government, and they had denounced the OES their first incidents of lying about the election in their press release. They denounced that at the OAS. And so he might have figured that these other countries could keep an eye on them. And I think he miscalculated there.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Mark Weisbrod, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks again, Mark, for having joined us today.
Thank you, Gregory.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Arlington, Virginia. Martin Luther King once famously called the United States the world's greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Two recently published studies seem to give substance to King's statement. They show that the cost of the so-called war on terror conducted by the United States has exceeded $6.4 trillion and at least 800,000 lives in the 18 years that it has been going on. The Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs conducted the studies, one of which was focused on the expense in terms of US taxpayer dollars, and the other focused on the lives lost directly because of the wars. Lives lost indirectly due to the loss of access to food, water, or infrastructure, or due to war-related disease, were not included in the count. Joining me now to discuss the report's findings is one of its authors, Neta Crawford. She is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University and the co-director of the Costs of War project that's based at both Boston and Brown universities. Thanks for joining us today, Neta.
Happy to be with you.
So let's start with the dollar cost of the war on terror, which is the part of the study that you focused on. Now, $6.4 trillion over 18 years comes to about $355 billion per year. That's almost exactly half of the 2019 defense budget of about $700 billion. However, when you look at only the overseas contingency operations budget, which is supposed to be the official cost of U.S. wars overseas, that figure is only $70 billion for 2019. So how do you calculate the dollar cost of the war, and why is it so different from the Pentagon's?
So the Pentagon has told you what they've asked for each year annually for spending on war zone. It's called overseas contingency operations. And that's the spending in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a few other places. The United States has troops using either military force or some other means in about 80 to 90 countries in the world. But the major war zones are Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Syria. And what we're looking at with the Cost of War project is the addition of all those costs from 2001 to the present. And our costs include not only the overseas contingency operations, but in addition, the costs of Department of State overseas contingency operations, as well as the costs that are associated with making war this long. So when you make war this long, obviously you have veterans, and the cost of veterans care is included in this accounting. In addition, the cost of homeland security is included in our accounting. These wars were funded through borrowing, not by taxation or war bonds. So you have to pay interest on borrowing to pay for the wars. That's included in our accounting. And then overall, the Department of Defense expenses have grown. We call this increases to the Pentagon base budget. And that has increased because the United States has been at war so long, and there have been additional costs associated with fighting.
Now, I want to look at the cost of war in terms of lives lost. Now, the breakdown in numbers is about 7,000 US soldiers, 8,000 military contractors or mercenaries, I guess you could also call them, about 256,000 enemy combatants, 175,000 local military and police, plus about 320,000 civilians. Now, the total, as I mentioned, comes to about 800,000. And this does not include indirect deaths. So what kinds of deaths are we talking about here in those 800,000? And do you have an estimate for the indirect deaths?
So if you look at just the war zones by themselves, in Afghanistan, about 157,000 people have lost their lives in the war since 2001. In Pakistan, it's about 66,000. So if you add Afghanistan and Pakistan together, that's well over 200,000 people. That's all sorts of people, from soldiers on both sides, combatants on both sides or all sides, to civilians, to humanitarian workers, to contractors, as you said, and journalists and media. When you look at the conflict in Iraq, there have been about 300,000 people, 270 or 300,000 people who've died in Iraq. That's all persons caused by all sorts of combatants. So militants, the US, its allies, the Iraqi police, and so on. And then the deaths in Syria since 2014, when the United States began its bombardment of Syria, is about 180,000 people. And that is, again, all combatants and non-combatants caused by these deaths caused by all sorts of actors.
And I was wondering also about the indirect deaths. I mean, I know that that's something that your study doesn't really get into, but is there a rough estimate? Because after all, if we really want to know the cost of war, that ought to be part of the consideration, no?
Yes. Indirect deaths, as you said, are those deaths and actually also there are injuries caused by the loss of infrastructure. And those infrastructurally caused deaths and injuries are due to the fact that people can't get, for instance, access to safe drinking water, or they're not able to get to hospitals to get care, or their children can't get vaccines. Now, the problem is that, and the reason why we don't actually make an estimate of this is that it varies depending on the context. So in places like Iraq, where there was a great deal of infrastructure, including electrification, when that infrastructure was destroyed, there was a much more dramatic impact in terms of indirect death. And in a place like Afghanistan, where there was less electrification and other infrastructure, the impact is much less. So there's really a range of deaths that one might attribute to loss of infrastructure, that is indirect death. So the Geneva Convention Secretariat estimates a range between, let's say, 1 and 20, or more likely 2 and 8. That is a ratio of direct death to indirect death. We don't make an estimate because we simply don't know. It would take a lot more research, epidemiological research, as well as survey, demographic research to find the real numbers. And that just hasn't been conducted in all the war zones.
Now, another key figure, which I haven't yet mentioned, is the number of refugees, which your website lists as being 21 million as a result of the war on terror. Now, this is an enormous number. And I'm wondering, if when we're to make a complete accounting of the true costs of the war, shouldn't that be included? And also, what about the financial cost to the affected countries? Now, I realize that this is also one of these gray areas that's going to be very difficult, but I'm just wondering if there's any way to do that in order to get a true estimate, not just to the US taxpayer, but to everyone who's been affected.
That's a very good question. I think that what you're talking about, that total numbers, is internally displaced persons and refugees. And in the case of Afghanistan, many of the refugees are in Pakistan. And in the case of the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, many displaced people are obviously still in the war zones, but also they're refugees in Iran, in Turkey, and Jordan, and other places in the region. So there is a burden. Most of the refugees are, in fact, locally, that is, within the region based. And there's also a cost to the international community in terms of care for refugees, and that care runs through non-governmental organizations as well as the United Nations. So I don't have an estimate of those costs.
Now, finally, war advocates might respond to these numbers by arguing that the cost in terms of dollars and in terms of lives would have been greater if the U.S. had not engaged in the war on terror. What's your response to that argument?
Well, about 3,000 people were killed in the 9/11 attacks. And since then, about a little bit more than twice that number of U.S. soldiers have died fighting in these war zones. Is the United States safer because of the wars? One might ask it this way. Following the 9/11 attacks, there were estimates of the numbers of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan, and there were estimates later in the other war zones of the number of militants in ISIS and other organizations that have followed on from Al-Qaeda. In no war zone is it the case that we have fewer militants. In fact, we've killed many tens of thousands of militants, that is, enemy combatants. Yet those organizations are roughly the same size today as they were when they started, when we started these wars. It's unclear that these wars are effective at killing militants. What they may be doing is making more militancy in the sense that people are defending themselves from U.S. and other countries' aggression. Would the United States have suffered more attacks? It could be the case that the Department of Homeland Security, which is nearly $1 trillion spent there since 9/11, since the Department of Homeland Security and other Homeland Security efforts began, it could be that they're actually doing the bulk of keeping us safe in the United States in terms of protecting infrastructure, preparing to respond to terrorist attacks, preventing terrorist attacks. And it might be that that's the better spending. Of course, what you've asked is a counterfactual. We just don't know. I think that it'd be good to know more about how it is that Homeland Security is making us safer.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Nita Crawford, professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University. Thanks again, Nita, for having joined us today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.